Welcome to FourSight U. Today, our topic is the prototype activity, specifically the prototype activity used in the FourSight Reveal workshop. And our aim is to understand how to make that great. Since there are a lot of ways to go with that activity, it's such a wide open sort of place where you can play and people can play. But our goal here is to really understand how you can consistently make that activity part of the workshop, which is really memorable, really helpful to people, and where they get a great deal of value out of it. So the first question logically is, why do we even do the prototype activity? What is that bringing to the workshop? What are the goals of doing it? Can you just leave it out because it's kind of a hassle and takes a lot of time? And like, what are you shooting to get out of it? The second is tips to set up the activity and to set it up so that you're going to get the biggest bang from it. Then we go into tells. For the facilitator, what are you looking for when you are watching people use that activity box? What do you want to keep track of? And what do you want to bring back into the debrief? And that's the fourth step, the best ways to debrief this activity. And finally, I would love to draw on the insights of this group, since you guys know a great deal about this and have used it a lot. So I am going to set up my screen. There we go. So on we go. Let's begin. Why do we do the prototype activity? And I actually will throw this open to the group. Why do you use the prototype activity when you use it in the webinar or in the workshop?
I use it as a way to, and I often use it right up front before folks have any even information about thinking styles, and they just immediately jump into it. And so it becomes a great way for them to then, as they're learning and going through the process of understanding what FourSight is all about, is to be able to reflect on that activity, and really to reflect back and see how their styles and how their preferences played out.
Nice.
I can jump in a little bit too. I think one of the things I like about it is it gives me a chance to get a sense for how the group is operating together, who might have more influence than others, how the group dynamic is. You get a sense for the room. It's fun. And then I think kind of what I think as Gina was saying is the idea that it's really easy to reference the FourSight breakdown after with that activity. And I think that helps make it really relevant for people because they can see, I think one of the strengths of FourSight is that it applies to anything we do. And so this shows them that this piece of paper, this thing that they just did, shows up in this activity that you just did. So I think it makes it very real and helps go from like something that's theoretical to something that actually shows up in how they do things. So I think there's a bunch of reasons, but those are a few.
Yeah, nice. And I would agree. And I was talking to Blair just this morning, like, what are all the reasons that we can think of to use it? And seeing those thinking preferences in action is really the most obvious one. Like, whether you know, Gina, whether your group knows what the four thinking preferences are and, what it all means, or whether they've heard nothing about this at all, like, they'll see it. And then and it's really a see for themselves. As soon as you do see it, see that this is a real thing, it becomes much more compelling to listen to the research, and you don't really have to take it on faith anymore that this is real and some researcher found this to be true. Really, it is so obvious that this is happening, even in groups where it's happening. One of the things that we found is that people who are, if you do the work of separating your group into type-alike teams, people also experience the compatibility factor of working with people and problem solving with people who think like they do. And there's something fascinating about that because we're attracted to people who think like we do. So we sort of naturally gravitate to that. But to actively be put in a group like that and experience it, and without knowing it, sort of think, wow, this group is great. These people really have it, like they get it. And then realize like, oh, that's what it's like when I'm with people who think just like I do. That's a very useful thing to debrief later as well. And really the emotional aspect of problem solving, and that's something I want to get into in this conversation. Like, how do you get that activity to surface some of the more vulnerable emotional aspects of solving problems? Because you're asking people to enter into problem solving in ambiguity, which is stressful by nature. And you're telling them, hey, you're going to be using these 4 types of thinking. So these are all the different things. Russ, I don't know if you're on a place to jump in, but I know you had a really interesting comment about why you use it as well.
Sure. I mean, similar to what Mike shared in some ways around assessing the team, but also to just create a climate that supports creativity and collaboration. So it tends to, if it's set up and debriefed well, kind of creates cognitive safety for those folks to collaborate in a really easy way that can be referenced back.
Yeah. Gina, you were going to add. You're going to have to unmute though.
Yeah. So that was the theme of the New York Times crossword puzzle yesterday, was you're on mute. Hysterical. So this is I'm glad we're going through this, because I sometimes have found that the impact of the activity isn't what I'm hoping that it will be. So I always set people up in type alike groups, or as close as I can. But oftentimes the kinds of things that they talk about when they do their after action review, what went well, what could you have done better, don't necessarily line up with their thinking profiles. And so it becomes hard to because it becomes hard to take this and then use it as a way of illustrating that when it's not coming out of the way that the group. So I'm just curious if other people have that experience or any suggestions. Maybe it makes sense to set it up differently from on the front end, and to give them some, do it a little bit later in the process so they have more information. But I'm curious what other people are thinking.
Well, I will say that honestly, the reason we're having this session is because of the conversation you and I had where you expressed that. And I thought, boy, I bet if Gina's feeling that, other people are probably feeling that too. So Nate, did you have something?
Yeah, I'll chime in real quick. And I made a comment in the chat about if you can get participants, if it's appropriate in that context, to record the activity. This allows you to do a deep dive after your debrief on the research, kind of further contextualize the theory and what it looks like in practice, anchor it in their lived experience of the exercise, but then play back that tape. Or if you're having a multi-day session, assign that for homework, and they have to come back with documented examples of where they saw the different preferences showing up in the, behaviorally from both themselves as well as the other folks on their team. That I think is the real sweet spot. So if you record it, you have the ability to go back and reference it over time. So that would just be a kind of a facilitator consideration I would throw out there for the group. Over. Interesting. I've never done that. That's very cool. Greg?
Yeah. So if you can't record it, or logistically it's tough to do, I stole a page from Russ's playbook, which is that you walk around and you listen to the groups and you write down some of the dialogue or some snippets or quotes from each one of the groups. So even if, in Gina's case, if they come away with things that are different, you can say, well, here are some of this is thinking style, and here are some of the things you said as you were going through the process of putting prototype together. So it's another way to kind of bring that to life and bring that thinking style to them so that you can springboard from there.
Totally. And I think that, Gina, to your point, it is incumbent on the facilitator to land this activity, and it's not altogether easy. So let me go through some of these slides that I've put together to really see, to take some of the risk out of it for you to make sure there's a higher hit rate. First, tips for setup. This is the obvious stuff. Comes in a bag. Here's what's in the bag. You want to make sure you give yourself 5 minutes before the program to assemble it. Don't, I assemble it right on the spot. I don't unpack that stuff because it travels really nicely in that flat pack. But as soon as I get there, I make sure I slam those things together, and don't forget, because that's a huge, like, if you forget, so don't forget. But before, the other preparation is you do want to do your best to put people in type-alike teams. Sometimes that's impossible. Sometimes you download the preferences from the invitation or print them out, whatever you want to use, and you sort them and you find, man, I can do 3 type-alike teams, but this team is a mixed team. Well, that's okay. But do your best to get groups of between, say, 2 and 5 people. Try to make the groups about the same size. And regardless of how you match, really, in my experience at least, the match you want to hit is the energy wave match. So you want to hit highs and lows rather than just say, okay, I have all clarifiers and all ideators and all implementers. If you have more wiggle room than that, get the clarifiers who are high clarifiers and also high ideators and drop off after that, and put them in a group, or get the clarifiers who also like to implement and put them in a group. The closer you can match these energy waves, the more obvious the differences will be. And again, sometimes you can't, but sorting it is your first defense about making this work. And also remembering, I actually spend in preparing this workshop, I probably spend most of my time thinking about these teams. Who's going to be in them? What's going to do? How many people? What are they likely to run into? Because then in the workshop, I sort of have this, I have a real sensibility about who's on what team and what they're going to do. So ideally, the other thing you can do is put people in separate rooms, because you're hiding these instructions. And as soon as one team finds a set of instructions, everyone's looking around and be like, wait, they've got instructions, and everybody finds the instructions. You are, in my experience, more likely to get a range of some people find them, some people don't find them. And that can be a useful thing to debrief. You don't ever want to put somebody, a team, in a situation where they can't find them and they're upset about it. We'll talk about that later. But the finding or not finding instructions is a really interesting debrief point. So that said, here are those instructions, just so you remember. We're asking people in the time specified, probably we usually give them between 10 and 12 minutes, something like that, 10, 15 minutes. Identify any kind of unmet consumer need. I wish they'd invent. Make a prototype of your invention using the materials provided, and then make an identical copy of it. We're asking them to give it a title, a description, and a brief presentation, and then everyone on the team must interact, and they're not allowed to tell. Those are all important components, partly because that's a lot of information and too much information in the time given. So again, it's probably more than most teams can manage, and watching teams figure out what to pay attention to and what they're just going to skip is a useful clue about thinking preference. Okay, so here's a really technical thing. The tape that comes on that bag that lets you stick the instructions into it is generally on the inner flap. So when you stick the instructions onto this piece of tape over here, you end up with a box that when you look into it, you see the question mark. 9 times out of 10, people find that set of instructions. I no longer put my instructions there. Now I pull the tape off and stick it to the outside of the flap so that when you fold that box up, when you look in, you see no instructions. You see the bottom of a box. There's a specific reason to do that. And that is, and then you fold up the top of the box and you're off to the races. There's a specific reason to do that because not finding the instructions is one of the great debrief points of the exercise. And Gina, this may be useful to you as you do it, but the instructions then, all you're telling people are, hey, everything you need to accomplish this challenge is in the box. You have 10 minutes. And you give them the boxes and say nothing. And then people are like, well, there are no instructions. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So you give them the box and here are the tells to watch for. I always take a little pad of paper so I can take notes, and I'm listening for people and I'm watching what they do because it all comes out of the box the same. But when you look at your group of clarifiers, 9 times out of 10, they immediately go to organize. Like the mashup is not a place they can start from. That is off-putting. That is not a stepping stone for good thinking. So the immediate inclination of the group of clarifiers is to organize by size, by color, by, gradation, by category. I mean, they will spend a lot of time organizing. They will also spend a lot of time reading the instructions if they find them and really asking, like, what does it mean what is an unmet need? They're looking at definition of the challenge. They're really trying to make sure they fully understand how you've defined the challenge. Other groups spend almost no time on that. Like, whatever, come up with something, great. But the clarified group, and if you can catch them saying any of this, like, well, how, what's an unmet consumer need? Or what does unmet mean? Or what is, they're literally trying to create a challenge that is more manageable than the wide open challenge we've given them. I've asked my clarifier friends, how do they feel about this activity? And they were like, oh, I hate the prompt. It's just way too wide open. They're really trying to make more sense of it than that. Okay, so ideators, at least in my experience, will dump the thing out and everybody will reach in and start to interact tactically, like play with the stuff, pull things out, you separate them. No problem with the mess. The mess remains exactly as messy as it always is. But they'll start thinking with their fingers and then see somebody else and connect ideas. Oh, wait, one more time. I got a backspace. Clarifiers, after doing all that organizing and getting all ready, then here's the next move. They fold their arms and sit back and talk about it. Like, they don't touch this stuff. They sit back and think it through. Like, what's this going to be? How do we want to do this? But they are not messing with the material when they're doing that. Which is true of the clarifier as a thinker. They really like to think things all the way through. So it's fascinating. You can physically see them sit back and be thinking these things through. So ideators, one of their superpowers is the combining thing. People who like to ideate like to take two ideas and mash them up and make a new idea. And you'll see that happen in the group. So if you can spot people saying, oh, well, we could use what you did and add what I did. That kind of combining is very, very typical of people who like to ideate. And there's a lot of laughter around that. Like, that's super fun. They also love it when they don't find the directions. Directions, no fun. No directions, very fun. So, and not a problem in any way. Developers, when they are really on their game and find the directions, this is the way they sort the material. They organize it, but they've read the directions that said, you need to make 2 matching prototypes. And developers will be like, whoa, 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 don't touch. Everybody put their stuff down. We've got to separate these by category. We've got to actually make exact replicas of what we're going to build. Because if you build one and you use all 8 clips, we're screwed. We can't make a duplicate. So like one of the things about people who like to develop is, like clarifiers, they like instructions, but they like them for a different reason. Clarifiers like instructions because they like to understand, you know, what direction to go. Developers like instructions because developers want to make the perfect solution. And the solution will not be perfect if it's not considering all the criteria for success. So they're reading instructions to understand what are the criteria for success here. And one of the criteria is you need to make a duplicate. So they separate. Fascinating to watch. Doesn't always happen, but it's fascinating. It's also true that people who like to develop will be much more concerned about the fact that like, I'm making a duplicate, and you know what? This clip on this one is orange and the one on the duplicate is red, but there's nothing I could do. I mean, they'll actively like worry about that. Whereas implementers could care less. They're like, look, I made 2. I mean, I didn't really have to, but I did. All right. And I did it faster than anybody else. They jump right in. I've never seen a group of implementers not blow up those balloons within like 15 seconds. They are on the balloon, blowing them up, moving things around. And then they realize like, oh, we've got 15 minutes, we've got 10 minutes. Somebody get a timer on that. Like, let's get the show on the road. We know what has to get done. So those are just the tells, as if you're being Russ and walking around the room and sort of observing what's happening. Those are a few of the tells that we've seen. Other tells that you guys know, I'd be curious.
Hey, Sarah, it's Deb. Sorry about my crazy transition here, but my favorite example for implementer is one that I use even if it doesn't happen in the room because it's just so vivid. So I had a situation where I was doing a 2-hour workshop. I had put materials out on the tables in these shoe boxes full of stuff before we had the little kits. And I stood in the center of the 4 tables and I said, okay, so on your table, you have a box. And then the next thing I heard was because somebody at the implementer table had upended this stuff and dumped it all over the table before I even finished the instructions. And so I let that happen and I laughed and just didn't say anything about it when they did it, but I sure went back to it and I go back to it every time.
That's great.
It's so good. So them.
It's so perfect. Nate, what were you going to say?
I can build on that one. So we're at the NATO school in Oberammergau and we lay out the activity. And as soon as we say go, a guy just takes his arm and sweeps all the materials that were on his table to create space for his team to work. And the woman sitting next to him goes, Joe, there was an empty table right next to us. So he didn't take the time to consider where else they might work. And now had created a situation where there was like Legos and markers and like old coffee cups, like all over the floor that they had to clean up. But he was so driven to create the conditions for the team to execute with a high implementer preference that it just didn't even cross his mind to look for other table space.
That is great. That is so funny.
This is going to sound terrible, but I just wonder who this individual was and whether there's somebody who was used to having people come along behind him and clean up after him.
Who knows?
I think for me, one thing I've seen too is like clarifiers are still paying attention to me, and like the implementers and ideators, they're gone. They don't care about me anymore, but the clarifiers are looking for me. They're like, aren't you going to tell me anymore? Kind of thing like that. I've used a different activity than this one, but it's still the same thing. They're waiting for that guidance, as the other groups don't really do that.
I love that. I love that waiting for guidance expression too. And I think that's so true. I think that's so true. In fact, that sort of is the next thing that I want to talk about, because this is, for me, what's changed the most in the way I debrief this activity. Handling there are no instructions, because as you say, Mike, you know, the ideators dump the box out and they're like, cool, fun, let's do something. They may not find the instructions, doesn't bother them a bit. The developers too were like, well, it doesn't seem like their instructions. Let's make something cool. Implementers just happy to be doing something with a timer on it. Like, that's fun. But the clarifiers really stop cold and get agitated. Like, there are no instructions. And then they get irritated. Like, there are no instructions. We're taking 10 minutes and and I've actually had a very well-mannered, lovely librarian yell at me after 3 minutes in where they hadn't found the instructions. She was like, there are no instructions. There are no directions. You can't give me something with no direction. She was really upset. So I'm right there next to her. I'm like, look, look, look. I'm right with you. Get the box, pick up the box. She's holding the box. She's shaking. She's so mad about this box. I was like, everything you need to complete this activity is inside the box. She's like, it isn't. She's shaking it. There's nothing inside the box. And I'm like, okay, I'm gonna say it again, super slow. I'm with you. Like, everything you need is inside the box. And she opens the lid and she was like, oh, instructions. Oh, great. Like, it was over. All that upset was gone in a heartbeat. She had the instructions. It's what she wanted. And I have seen that play out many, many, many times. And I never let somebody get librarian angry. I'm careful. I'm much more careful now not to go that far. But I do let groups struggle, particularly groups who are clarifier groups, let them experience the stress of not finding the instructions, partly because it's really helpful for other groups to realize, oh my God, that was terrible for them. That was really an actively unpleasant experience for them. They were stressed. They were not happy. It wasn't like, great, we have wiggle room now. It was like, oh my God, this is a waste of time. And so, in a recent group that was maybe 12 people, 10 of them were high clarifiers. So this whole group was so slanted toward the clarify preference. And there were 2 people in the group. One was an ideator and one was an implementer. And I'd been told, we have some problem people in our group. Well, guess who the problem people were? The ideator and the implementer. And so I purposely let this group of clarifiers not find those instructions and then debrief the level of stress. And the people who were ideators and implementers realized, like, wow, whenever I work with people who are clarifiers, I want to make sure they are taken care of with instructions, like that they have what they need and they've had an opportunity to ask questions. Like, for a leader to realize this person in my group has a preference to clarify and I need to take care of it. That's, again, they experience that as an emotional thing. Doug, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So besides not aggravating the clarifiers, what's the downside of actually allowing people to have the instructions?
There's the downside of letting them have the instructions is that the ideators, they actually don't like the instructions. It's like a big downer. It's like they get an activity, they're sitting in a group, they're so happy, they're like, wow, this is a great workshop. We get to just play with, like, balloons. And then someone finds the instructions, are like, oh, okay, all right. So it's literally the reverse experience, and that's worth debriefing too. In this group of 12 that I told you about, a couple of people didn't find the instructions, and I let the group of developers who didn't find the instructions never find the instructions. Like, I didn't make sure they were, because they weren't upset about it. Like, and I asked, now, who was upset about not finding the instructions? Every clarifier hand went up, like, oh, super stressful. Anyone else? Nobody else. So it really cuts very different ways when you when you do.
So the lesson for the clarifiers then, well, I guess didn't the developers didn't raise their hand too and say
They
that that
didn't.
aggravated them?
You know, it wasn't aggravating for them. You know, they found something to do, got really into the solution they were making, and they were fine.
And the lesson for the clarifiers is how it's just an example, I guess, of when it is not a clear problem to solve, they're gonna get stuck. Is that
Yeah.
right?
There's the
Okay.
analysis paralysis, like, oh,
Got
and
it.
it's emotional. It's almost a physical feeling.
Right.
And good to, and that they have permission to ask for clarity, and that it's not just a lesson for the clarifiers, it's a lesson for people who collaborate with clarifiers. Like, give these people what they need. It may not be what you need, but
Mm,
it would be what they need.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Megan.
Yeah, I wanted to build upon that question, Doug. So thank you, because I've had some groups where kind of tying in with some of this research that Gerard presented recently to FourSight U by industry, there tends to be certain types of preferences. And I've had different groups, for example, people that work in a library, archivists. And it is just like they're all high clarifiers. And when I run this activity toward the beginning of a session, to that point, like I don't want the 90% of my participants at the beginning of a session where some of them are already nervous about this and all the people and whatever to feel down, like a negative energy draw for the sake of learning a little lesson. So there have been times where I've just been like, look at the, make sure you look at the bottom of the box, and just because I'm like, then it's fun because they find it themselves or whatever. But because I think it's a little bit of art and science here that I love your point about really pushing the learning. But I think sometimes as facilitators, we need to also make that choice of when do we want to give them a fun little hint. And also sometimes I've done with groups like that, instead of just saying like a consumer need, I try to loop it in a little bit more thematically with their type of industry so that at least they're not like, I'm doing this, we're spending all this time doing this random activity, that at least if I tie it in, let's say with something in the library sciences or something, or like information sciences, that they're a little bit more like, it's not totally out of left field and just for the flow of the session. And then I try to, in the debrief, go a little bit deeper. So it just depends on the group.
That makes so much sense, Megan. I mean, the whole notion of being sensitive to who is your group. If you got a whole lot of clarifiers, this is painful. This is not, and so you don't want to put them through, again, you don't want to put them into a down situation. And, you read that right. It sounds like you really, let them experience that for 15 seconds, 20 seconds, because they'll have the feeling, and let them be successful finding those instructions. Totally makes sense. And also,
we want them to have fun. We want them but one of the main things, we want them to have fun so that they can learn.
Right. Like my librarian, not a repeat performance. Like that is not what we're gunning for. That was my learning for all of us. Yeah. Any questions about that? Because I do think, Megan, that's really right. You want to be sensitized to your group. I used to think it was a gotcha thing, and I really don't like that. I don't like the notion that, haha, you didn't find my directions. It's because every group is successful, and that's sort of the point. You've given them a challenge. It's ambiguous. They all make something. They did it. That was good. And that's the thing to emphasize. So, in the presentations, couple of things that can be helpful. First of all, if any team didn't find the directions, ask them to do the debrief first, because they'll go through, they'll present their thing. You got to celebrate their success because they did it right. They did this right. And you want to make sure that they get full marks for doing it. And only at that point would you invite a team that found the directions to present. And you might call out the fact that like, hey, you guys did a really good job following the directions of, making a duplicate. And then you get the call from the side of the room. What? Directions? Who? You know, and you can say, hey, there were directions. You know, it's one of the things we want to experience. You all did this really well. And directions are just a part of a project that has a lot of ambiguity. So finding it is fine. Not finding it, fine. What we're interested in here is not whether or not you found it. It's what your experience of finding it or not finding it was. And also point out, this was Blair. He's like, and point out that they're not allowed to tell if they find the directions, so that their, you know, their colleagues weren't just selling them short by not telling them about the directions. Because you certainly, I mean, to Megan's point, don't want to make anybody feel bad about this whole thing. In the debrief, we used to say, at your table, focusing on the process, not the product, talk about what went well and what you could have been better at. And Gina, I think that's the debrief that you've been using. You know, what at your table went well and what could you have been better at? My experience is that when you ask those questions, people often come back with, oh, we got along well, everybody listened, you know, it was fun, we came up with something we liked, and everybody comes up with that. So it's not, you're not teasing out what you need. We, as a result, changed this debrief a little bit, and now there are new slides that you'll find when you go to your learner map, your presenting learner map, and download the latest slides. They open with an introduction of, like, the FourSight insight is that there are 4 types of thinking you need to solve a complex problem. And here they are. So before they even do the activity, we say, you need to clarify and ideate and develop and implement. And here's what happens when you do that. Then we throw them into the exercise. The truth is, it doesn't make any difference if you tell them or not. It doesn't change their behavior one whit in the exercise, knowing. Total disconnect between doing, because their thinking preferences are running the operation, as you well know. So the new debrief, instead of saying what went well and what didn't go so well, we give them time to think, like, when did you do those 4 types of thinking? And have people answer, well, we clarified when we did this, and we ideated when we did this. So you're starting to teach them the whole, you sensitize them to the metacognition that they need to understand in order to do it more effectively. And then you go into the question, like, when was your group most energized? You know, where did you maybe skip over or lose energy? So specifically, these are the slides that we run. Reflecting on your process, you know, when did you clarify, ideate, develop, and implement? In the slides, as written, we ask people to write down that as an individual reflection, which you can do, and then ask them where they were most energized and least energized. But in the interest of time, if you're running short, you can also just ask this of the group. And Gina, this is generally where you'll surface some of these things.
I think this makes all the difference in the world, because the way that you're outlining it here is you're giving them specific prompts relating to what you want them to be exploring, as opposed to what went well. And what you described is exactly what I get, like, time and time. Yeah, we worked really well. We all listened to each other. We had a good time, blah, 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 blah. And everybody says the same thing. And it doesn't, you know, you're not teasing out those thinking styles and the differences. So having this, you know, this specified prompt of relating it to, we've had this bit of information, now you've done this activity, now you can connect all the dots. I think this should make a huge difference. And the question about energy, right? Where were you the most energized? Absolutely. Yeah. Cool.
And I've certainly seen groups get it here. And particularly because you can drop in the comments that you took notes on. In other words, if nobody kind of knows when they clarified, you can say, hey, I heard this group over here talk about, like, understanding what is an unmet need. Like, you're clarifying the directions. That's clarifying. So you can call out specific behaviors if they're having trouble identifying. And again, then you're surfacing the type alike behaviors that you're looking for. And then this is the way the slides close with, hey, we've run this activity with loads of different groups from around the world. And this is generally what we see. We see that people who like to clarify tend to organize the items from the box, like you guys did over there, that they think through their approach deliberately, instead of what everyone else did, grab the materials or wipe everything off the table, like they organize the materials and sit back and think about it. And you can describe this even if nobody in the group did it, because this is true. This is what we see over and over. And that if the instructions are lost, they feel huge relief at finding the directions. Whereas the ideators, lots of ideas, wacky ideas, lots of laughter, delight, love that it's an open-ended project with no directions, kind of bummed to find the directions. And in terms of the pitch, almost every time I've seen it, it's just totally improv. Like, oh, I'll do it. Boom. Somebody's off doing the pitch. Hadn't given a minute of thought, but it's great. And they're having a great time doing it. The develop group, people who like to develop, will pretty consistently build to specifications. They want to make sure that's done right. They want to read the directions. They want to make that second prototype, because they're taking this all so literally, because they've been asked to. They tend to run out of time for their pitch. Unlike the implementers who will jump in, get right to the task, start building, maybe come up with one idea. Yep, that sounds great. Let's make that. They're not shooting for perfection, but they are shooting for done. Like, I will often see the implementer group be done at minute 8. Like, oh, we are so superior. Huh. They're folding their arms because they're done. The clarifiers are folding their arms because they're not going to start until they really understand. But yeah, the body language represents very different things for those groups. Thoughts about that? And I'd be curious if other people have seen other things emerge in these patterns that we should add to our list.
Hey, Sarah, it's Deb.
Go ahead.
I would say implementers often in my groups don't get to the second prototype because they don't find the instructions. They don't know that they need to make a second. And they don't care when it's pointed out to them. Like, they're unabashed about it. Like, whatever, we got ours done and that's it. We're finished. And I feel like the developers sometimes don't finish the task because they're too busy tweaking and refining and, kind of recommending changes and trying to reach consensus on it.
Yeah.
I have a question. It's Tanya here. I mean, I really love this, what you're doing. I think it's fantastic. My question is, the last facilitation I did, I think we had 4 or 5 integrators in the room. So, people will want, I'm saying, could this be expanded? What are people doing per profile?
Great
Could that be
question.
identified? I know that's creating more work, but I think, with 4 integrators in the room, they were really curious how they interacted and what were the signs and and why they did what they did.
Great question. And I'll let Russ weigh on it, but let me just say, the integrator is a tricky one to handle for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not a thinking preference, right? Like there are 4 thinking preferences to clarify, to ideate, develop, and implement. An integrator is someone, it's a profile, not a preference. So it's a profile that has equal preferences for all 4 of those. So it's, from just a straight teaching point of view, it's always tricky to figure out, should we just emphasize the 4 types of thinking and then talk about the integrator as a profile that experiences that slightly differently in their own unique way? Or do you highlight that as their own separate group. Like if I have enough integrators, Tanya, I'll definitely put them into a group together. Because they enjoy not getting railroaded by someone who's got a preference. Like everybody's sort of thinking the whole thing through at once. They tend to be very compatible. They tend to listen to each other real well. And I'll debrief it that way. Russ, what do you think about this?
Yeah, to that point, sometimes, you'll put an integrator in with another group because you don't have enough integrators. So, but when I have enough, generally that will be where my observations come in terms of, like, I noticed out of the 12 minutes, you spent about 4 on clarify, 3 on ID, or whatever. They spend more even time. And once they find the directions, or sometimes if they don't find the directions, what they'll do is they'll create a challenge. So they'll define a challenge and then they go through it relatively evenly. So, in terms of this slide, generally I do it as you framed it in terms of here's what we generally see. Integrators, you can ask them and they'll say, well, we went through it pretty evenly. We didn't get super excited. We didn't lose energy.
And I love that idea, Russ, that you're talking about, that you're paying attention to them, because that's the hazard, is that you just blow it off. It's a little too complicated. And, as you say, Tanya, like, well, we don't know what to do with it. But like, to actually pay attention to that group, to note what they're doing, and to feed that back as a learning for everybody, it lets them have a moment of well-deserved recognition.
And you would do the same if you had a mixed preference group. For example, if you had some random profiles and you sort of just put them together, it helps to just observe and listen to, oh, I noticed Robert was saying, what about this? What about that? What about that? And everyone else was, so you can use some of their language or their quotes, and that just validates their experience.
Yeah, Gina, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm wondering, because I had a similar experience, and I do like putting implementer or integrators into a group if I can. And when I have, it always feels like all of this material is organized around these 4 thinking preferences, and they're kind of almost like the redheaded stepchildren. And so I would maybe like to see, for example, this slide with 5 sections on it, and 1 for integrators. Like, how do integrators what might we see from them? Now, I know we could start to get into like two-way and 3-way and all that, but specifically looking at integrators. And I think also because there is already a tendency there to be the glue, to be the relational people, all of that, that I like the idea of giving them, not just pointing to them, but actually putting them up here and giving them their own space in the presentation.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Early on, when I was debriefing my integrator group, I felt like they either thought they won the jackpot because they had the best profile because they were even, like, whoa, or they got nothing. Like, I don't have a profile. Like, somehow the way I was wording it, the way I was languaging it, felt like they were either winning or losing this game. And I've tried to be really much more conscious of identifying the integrator as its own unique profile. The challenge of putting it up here in these 4 is these are not profiles. These are preferences. And the integrator has the even preferences. So it's not, you're mixing apples and oranges to put it up here. But I do think really calling out, like, hey, we had a group of integrators here, and they, and that's a special profile. They behave differently than all other profiles, to call them out as unique, because they really are. I think I'd probably be more inclined to do that than add a fifth section, because then you get the idea that that's one of the preferences, which it isn't. You know,
You know, can I add in here? I really appreciate you making this distinction between preference and profile. Does that mean there could be another slide that describes profiles to call that out more clearly? Because you're making a very clear distinction here. I personally don't know that that has rung through for me as clear in my mind, or even delivering to clients as a result when we do the debrief.
it makes sense. Yeah, just the notion that your
Mhm.
profile is made up of your, you know, combination of preferences. You may prefer one
Mhm.
thing,
Exactly.
you know. Yeah,
Mhm.
so a profile is different. Russ, did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, it's really just a balance of time, honestly. So, for me, the purpose or one of the purposes of this activity is just the notion that groups, depending on their preferences, either their type alike preferences or mixture, tend to go through the activity differently. They'll either have certain high energy, low energy, or if you're an integrator, they may go through evenly. And for me, that's where I try to keep this activity. And then in terms of the profiles, that's really where the individual debrief comes through when you go through that information in the pair conversations, etc. So, it's kind of trying to sequence the learning or the experience so that they understand enough to go to the next step for me.
Yeah, and I would say, that this is what we've got, but we have a few minutes and I'd love to hear, other experiences, other insights, things that we should all incorporate into our practice, best practices that you guys have come up with.
I
Megan?
did have a question. I'm wondering
Oh,
if I
sure.
could, in terms of timeline, and it probably varies by group and by size of group and things like that, but do you have a rough idea now? This is a little bit new to me in the way that we're doing it now, the way that you're doing it now, on from start to go, like how long this chunk of your activity length of the whole session lasts? Is it like an hour or so?
Russ,
Or
you are much better at this than I am.
So Mike, it depends. So if you have 90 minutes as an example, so very often people may have 90 minutes, they may have 2 hours. Clearly, the longer you have, the longer you can extend the debrief or you can shut it down. In my experience, it's like a minute or two to set it up, 12 minutes to do it, right? That's 15. Sorry, I'm breaking it down. 10 minutes for them to think about where they clarified, share out. So, and then your debrief. So 30 minutes would be kind of pretty quick, 35, 40. If I have a 2-hour session, this could take 40 minutes. And it also depends on the group size.
Yeah, I was gonna
It's
say.
much different if Sarah's doing it with 12 people. I just did a session where it was 35. So, the groups are going to impact. I try to keep it under 40 though.
Yeah, and if it's that big, you do want larger numbers of people in a group. You want 6, maybe 7 people in a group, because you just have too many presentations, and then we're like,
Great. Thank you so much. That's helpful. Thanks.
Megan?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I always try to focus on, that I know I always mention in these calls, is the importance of talking about, like, people who get a lot of energy from implementing tend to do these things when building. See, this team tended to do this, and not always trying to get away from the this idea that implementers do this and this is what implementers do. Because the point of knowing their profile is not to know their profile, it's so that they have greater self-awareness, so when engaging with the entire creative process, that they're more aware and always reinforcing the fact that they can do all of them. And so something that I really try to focus on when debriefing this is always like, remember, even though you maybe have this preference, your group tended to do this, you were fully capable of doing all the steps, you know, and using that as something. And I try to go back to that when talking about a preference versus ability. And so I encourage all of you to keep doing that too.
I think that's really good. And I also think this new debrief, the idea of like, when did you clarify? When did you, of course you did all these things. Like you did all these things. Your group perfectly capable of all of it. You may have been energized by some things versus others, but I really like the distinction that you're making, Megan. Thank you for bringing that up. It's really good. Tammy, you're new at this. Have you tried this out with a group yet?
I have not, and I'm looking forward to it, but I have not as of yet. Getting ready for certification provided time challenges for me to bring groups together and to do all of that, but I am looking forward to the activity.
Well, I hope this was helpful. I realize we don't necessarily get into the nitty-gritty of this, and it was really thanks to Gina who said, you know, I'm not getting the most out of that prototype activity. And I was like, oh, I feel like my practice has gotten better using these specific things. So we thought we'd try to share out as much as we could, but also hear what other people have come up with. So thank you guys for coming today. We will officially close it here, but I'll stay on. I'm sure Russ will stay on for a little bit to hear what's going on in your world, but thank you for coming.